Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into today's discussion, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from its heyday of 48 stores till today when the Strand is now the sole survivor of Book Row, run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so very appreciative of it. Today, we are thrilled to have with us two brilliant novelists, Jennifer Makumbi and Sulaiman Addonia. We will be discussing Jennifer's new novel, A Girl is a Body of Water, and Sulaiman's Silence is My Mother Tongue. Sulaiman Addonia spent his early life in a refugee camp and went on to earn an MA from the University of London. His novel, The Consequences of Love, was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and translated into more than 20 languages. Jennifer Mccombie is a recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize, and her first novel, Kintu, won the Kwani Manuscript Project Prize in 2013 and was longlisted for the Etisalat Prize in 2014. Her story, Let's Tell This Story Properly, was the global winner of the 2014 Commonwealth Short Story Prize. Jennifer lives in Manchester, UK with her husband and son. We will first begin tonight's event with a brief reading by Jennifer, followed by a brief reading by Sulaiman before launching into tonight's discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jennifer to the stage.
Hi, Sibyl. Thanks for hosting us. And thank you everyone else who's joined us this afternoon. I'm going to read from a part where my main character, Chirabo, is talking to an old woman who is supposed to be a witch, but really who is a traditional feminist. And she's talking about how women seem to oppress women more than men do. And this is how the old woman talks to her. I told you grandfather is easy. Tom, I mean my father, is the same. They don't put barriers against me. It is grandmother. It's always other women, apart from you, who put up barriers against girls and on themselves. I know men can be tyrants, but a lot of women are nasty to women. Everybody says it, unless you've not met my Jaja Unsanji, grandfather's sister. Chirabo, says the witch, have you seen God come down from heaven to make humans behave? No. That is because some people have appointed themselves his police. And I tell you, child, the police are far more worse than God himself. That is why the day you catch your man with another woman, you'll go for the woman and not him. My grandmothers called it kwelma. That is when oppressed people turn on each other or on themselves and bite. It is a form of relief. If you cannot bite your oppressor, you bite yourself. For a while, Chirabo was silent. Then she blurted out, but grandmother does not police herself. Did you know Alexa has a beautiful voice? Who is Alexa? Your grandmother. You did not know her name. Chirabo twisted her lips. All she knew was Mccombie. Alexa Rose, no. Those were her names before she married. Grandmother's voice is gruff. No, child. Alexa has the most beautiful voice in this world, deep like a humming drum, yet soft. When we were young, I wanted a voice like hers. Unfortunately, since we have grown up, she tries to make it thin and it comes out gruff. And did all the women shrink? Shira steered Nsota away from her grandmother. With that kind of perversion, who would not shrink? Who would want to be huge or loud or brave or any of those other characteristics men claim to be male? We hunched, lowered our eyes, voices, acted feeble, helpless. Even being clever became unattractive. Soon, being shrunken became feminine. Then it became beautiful, and women aspired to it. That was when we began to persecute our original state out of ourselves. Once we shrunk, men had to look after us, and it was not long before they started to own us. Fathers sold daughters, husbands bought wives, and once we became commodity, men could do whatever they wished with us. Even now, our bodies do not belong to us. That is why when they need it, they grab it. Things were so bad in some cultures, women had to be hidden away to protect them in separate spaces where no men were allowed. Soon, they had to be spoken for by men. Thank you.
Right. So my name is Sulaiman, and I'm so excited to be here in conversation, especially with Jennifer. Um, and thank you for tuning in. And I'm going to read from a section which kind of tells a little bit about the background of the book, but also the inspiration for this book, which was in 2008, after I published my first novel. I went to Paris and I saw Degas' painting of a nude woman taking a bath and in a bucket, and the bucket reminded me of a refugee camp. And then it kind of triggered something in me, and that's when I decided to kind of paint Saba, who is my main character, in words. So this is a section, Saba taking a bath inside a bucket. Saba sat inside the bucket and closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Peace in this place was only present in her imagination. So Saba imagined she was in a river, floating naked past trees, wilderness, villages, animals, life. She felt the rain on her body. Peace, Saba mumbled, pressing her weight into the bucket, into a moment alone so blissful. The wind caressed back. It was making love to her, or so she felt, as it blew through cracks in the door and walls and gaps in the thatch roof, stroking her wet skin from all directions, kissing her ears, the bone at her nape, the curves of her breast. Saba wanted to possess. She arched her back, revealing more of herself to the wind, directing this mysterious lover to where she liked to be touched and how. With the element at her behest, suddenly the door opened. Her mother storming in past her, pulling her scarf, over her face. Saba dried her body and stood by the pole as water dripped from her hair. She wrapped her arms around herself. A tremor of unsatisfied desire went through her. It took her a while before she managed to contain the fire under her wet skin, and instead of walking to her mother, Saba sat on her blanket and asked her mother in a low voice what had happened. Thank you.
Thank you both for that amazing reading, or those amazing readings. We start off with a rather broad theme for the discussion, where it's the individual against the backdrop of community. But I think it would be useful if we sort of set the stage a bit for everyone. So maybe Jennifer, you could first tell us a bit about Karabo's family and their expectations of her. And for those who haven't read the book yet, we will be doing our best to avoid any spoilers. Karabo is the protagonist of Jennifer's novel. And then after Jennifer speaks to that, Sulaiman, if you could please tell us about Saba's family and the setting of the refugee camp.
Thank you, Isabel. So Chirabo, my protagonist, is a 12-year-old girl, and she's growing up with her grandparents in a rural village. This is in 1975. And she's loved. She's surrounded by a lot of love. She's living also with her teenage aunties and uncles because her dad had her very young when he was in school. So this is why it's her grandparents bringing her up. But she's also surrounded by a large community of village residents, and they're all parenting her. They're either mothers or their grandparents or their aunts, you know. So she has a very wide family around her. But despite the fact that she's loved, she is a girl. And the body of a girl puts limitations on her. So unlike boys, she's not expected to climb trees. She's supposed to sit in a particular way because there's something foul between her legs. And she does not like doing chores, all the things that girls are supposed to like doing, like looking after babies or doing chores or being a good girl. So it's these restrictions that are put against her that then start to make her push against the society, even though she's loved. So it's basically for her, it's the body that puts limits against her. And this is where she finds that most of the time, she wants to fly out of her body.
Well, for me, thank you, Jennifer. For me, so in my book, we have a few characters actually, but it's I would say the main characters are Saba and Hagos, brother and sister. So Hagos is about 6 years older than Saba, and they are both half Eritrean and half Ethiopian. And Hagos, it was discovered he was mute when he was about to start school back home in Eritrea. So his poor parents, decided to pull him out of school and invest whatever little money they had into the education of the next child, who happened to be this girl, Saba. So as a result, Hagos grows up illiterate or not able to read, speak, or write. And so the book is mainly told from the perspective of Saba, and it starts or begins when they flee the war to a refugee camp in Sudan. And one of the main themes I deal with in the book is told from Saba's perspective about Hagos's life, and especially the absences in his life, be it love, friendship, sex, for which Saba feels responsible because she had deprived him from school, and so therefore from communication, which she feels are the basis to build all those kind of relationship between human beings. And so, yeah, so it's a book that is set in a refugee camp, but it's mainly about the intimate life of my characters.
Both of your characters are these young women who in many ways are trying to sort of escape the sort of societal expectations put on them to like claim autonomy over their future and themselves. And so I was curious, what drives them? How do they reach that point? And why don't we start off with you, Sulaiman, for this one?
Well, basically, for me, before they fled Eritrea to Sudan, to the refugee camp in Sudan, Saba had already a goal set in her mind, and education was everything for her. And she was the best in her school, and everything in her life revolved around education. And, to the point that she ignored everyone else in her life. She was totally focused. But what happened was that when the war happened and they flee to the refugee camp, there's no school in a refugee camp. And obviously she's mourning that kind of main drive that has been the main drive in her life up to that point. But what happened is that she slowly begins to discover other drives or her capacity that she actually had other drives in her life, or other beautiful things in her life, and one of them is Hagos, her brother, her mute brother. And so in a way the war brought them together, because we in a place of absence and scarcity, in this place of scarcity, they both sleep in the same on the same blanket, and so they are together by day and night, and almost like, they see the world together, and their voice becomes one, and Saba becomes his voice. But having said that, there's also what drives Saba is that this kind of ability of discovery. She's someone who discovers, the short piece I read before, is that someone who's not afraid to discover her body, someone to actually be confronted or confront herself with the wounds that she carries on her skin. And so, yeah, I mean, we get very, very intimate access to her world and her drives, which also we begin to see that when refugees migrate to refugee camp, they are refugees. But what happens when you actually focus in one person like Saba, for example, is that you see the richness in the interior.
Thank you for that, Sulaiman. What drives Chirabo really in the beginning is the fact that she feels that things are not right. For Chirabo, things are so wrong. Why should the boys have all the fun? And she has an enabling grandfather who's always telling her she's as good as everyone else. And in school, when she's with the boys, she's cleverer sometimes. So she does not understand why people should put all these barriers on her. And so when she goes to talk to the witch because she's flying out of her body, then she gets this person who pushes her further on, because the witch also thinks, okay, here is a young child who is ready to rebel. And my role is to prepare her for that rebellion. So the witch starts to talk to her in a way that prepares her to be not just a rebel, but a traditional feminist who understands what she's doing. So she's given more energy by this woman. And when she's taken to a girls' boarding school where there are no boys, the nuns themselves have elements of feminism in themselves, and the girls, there are interesting dynamics going on in the school. And she will quickly find herself slotting into certain spaces, and it's all that energy plus her innate feeling that things are not right and I deserve to be treated just like boys, that drives her throughout the novel.
What's curious, both of your answers spoke to this idea that one, it's both internal, but two, it's also about an obligation to their families in some sense, or like done through. For Karabo, it's not quite an obligation to her family. Her family has a like permissiveness which allows her to flourish. And so I'm curious how you reconciled in your books that sort of the demands of family against their ambitions, their dreams, their sense of identity. Like, and we can start with you, Jennifer, for this one. But how does Karabo navigate that?
Well, at first, especially when she's still living with her grandparents, Chilabo flies literally and figuratively. She has wings and she's going as far as possible, and the witch is pushing her on. But as she gets older and realizes that she does not fit in with her dad comfortably, and she does not fit in with her mother comfortably, and she's looked after by her aunt, she starts to compromise a little bit. In fact, the witch later tells her that I thought you would rip everything up and just leave everything torn apart in your wake. And she starts to compromise, but because of that background that she was given by the witch, she's able to work out different ways in which to carry on with her thinking, with her rebellion, with her way of being, without really hurting her grandfather. Because that is one of the things that kind of limits Chirabo, her love for her grandparents, not wanting to hurt them, you know. And so there are moments when she would like to just go wild, but then especially in that meeting when they are with the elders, she would like to say a few things, and actually some sounds escaped her, but whenever she looks at her grandfather, and she does not want to bring um 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 to dishonor him. And I think these obligations tend to hold girls and women down a lot. These obligations to families, whether it's to parents, grandparents, to brothers or sisters, they tend to hold us down. And when I was reading your book, Sulaiman, I kept on thinking, yes, God, this is Eritrea, and it's so like Uganda. What is going on?
Yeah, I think all families are the same, all societies are the same, and all cultures in a way are the same, you know. Yeah, I totally see that, because for me, I think with what I found with Saba is that is that one of the issues that her family, or especially her mother and the midwife, who's the best friend of her mother, have with Saba, is that she doesn't have obligation or sense of obligation to her family at the beginning anyway, when they live back home, for example, is that she's totally focused. And so they see her focus as a kind of a masculine attribute, something that is so unfeminine. And so therefore they try to kind of, beat this woman out of her all the time, in all, using through different techniques or acts or whatever. But she is so determined to hold on to her dreams, to her ideas, to her sense of drive that I spoke about before, that she doesn't really give a damn or an F about those kind of obligation. And then when she moves to the camp, she moves with that sense. But then what happens when she doesn't have the school? And so, she naturally has that kind of drive to put her family to the side and focus on her ideas. And I think, and that's what pits her, against the society, against that tradition. And that's what kind of prepares her to do one of the final acts in the book, which is to redefine her idea of a family, redefine her idea of love, redefine her idea of sex, And so, for me, working with Saba to come to that point where she's actually knowing, for example, that Hagos was in love with her husband, and her husband actually married her because he was in love with her brother. And she actually understood that. And she said, okay, right, there's that kind of love. Then, I think what we saw was that she has the power to say, I'm going to recreate my own idea of a family to facilitate that love.
I think with your character, I was there with Saba thinking, come on, you've got to cut these ties, because on one hand, you have a loving mother, but then you have that figure of the
midwife.
friend of the midwife, who was just so when Saba redefines her family, it's heartbreaking, because you watch Hagos and they're almost together like Samir's twins, and you feel that they've been cut, but on the other hand, you're like, you've got to do what you've got to do, girl.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, just to come back to Jennifer, and I think, and that's one of the things which I actually note here, one thing very interesting that you said earlier, which was, you mentioned to prepare her. And for me, I found that sentence incredibly fascinating, because earlier, before we came here, because before we opened to the audience, we're discussing about the role of a writer and how, you know, how this sense like of actually being there, but kind of taking yourself out of the picture. And I just want to ask you about that particular phrase that you used, Jennifer, to prepare her. Could you please tell me a bit more? I'm really fascinated.
About taking yourself out of your body.
Yeah, but also you were saying, like, you were talking about your character, you know, you prepared her, and then clearly she flew in every sense and direction. I mean, yeah, I was just fascinated by that. How do you prepare your character, and how do you distance yourself from them, and at what point?
Um, One, because I stayed with this book for a very long time, you know,
Right.
and so often it's not at the beginning of the book. I can write the book, you know, and complete it, but it's when I get to know the character in and out, so that I know if I put her on in my house, what she would say, what she would do, you know, that
Right.
knowing of your character so well, you know. And when, if you can do that, if you can get to know your character that well, then you are ready to let her go. And when you let her go is when she then guides you to who she is, to what she does, rather than what I had planned, that this is what she would do, this is where she would go. So as you could see in my book, I had prepared that Chirabo was going to let rip. That was my plan. But then things happened to her, and she started to guide me on what she can do and what she can't do. And when I stopped imposing that, she started to fly. For me, she was right there. She was a person. She was not my creature.
Oh, fantastic! Because you know, I'm just one more, Sabir, before we come back to you. I was thinking, because with Jennifer we're talking before about the imagination, and how, you know, with my characters, for example, I was very judgmental at the beginning, you know, especially with Jamal, for example, and someone, Jamal, who had this kind of sexual fascination, which I found at the initially very of desires, or his notion of what desires are, very difficult to follow at the beginning. And I was very judgmental. And then I decided to kind of work on that, on how to become unjudgmental. And I quite like to prepare her, because to me, and that's one of the things I've noticed with myself, is that it is really about that. It's about actually knowing the characters inside out, and then letting them grow, be, and then just take yourself. And it's not easy to do.
No, it's not, because you've got to inhabit their bodies.
Yeah.
You've got to let yourself behind and just be. You know what, when you finish writing a book and it is stopped, but for you the characters carry on. You know what has got up into them.
Yeah.
Oh, sometimes the book starts, but you know where the characters started, you know, which is not included in the book. You know, that idea of knowing your character, knowing if you met her, how she would relate to you, the things that she would say. It's until you get to know your character that well that you can make the reader relate to that character that well.
Right. Thank you.
Oh, just to dig in a bit there with the sort of line of like preparing the characters. One of the things I loved was the way the witch sort of grooms Garabo to ask questions about stories in general, like the way stories shape our lives, the way they tell us who we are, and particularly the way stories are very gendered, often told by men and used to like disenfranchise women. And so I was curious how you approach those stories, Jennifer. Like, did you have them in mind as you were sort of like dissecting the myths? Was this something you found throughout the writing process?
Well, first of all, I related to those stories in so many different ways. So when I was a child, all those stories were told to me, and I used to tell them as a child, and they were innocent. They were really innocent. Like the story of the Lukokove who comes out every night in the evening and then takes a pig ride on a young man's bike back. I used to tell, and my grandparents would look, with a very straight face. I had no idea what I was talking about. So it's until I think when I was doing my first degree that for literature, we looked at African oral traditions as the forms that were left behind by our ancestors. And we were told that these forms are coded. What you're reading is what the stories you're telling are not what they are. You've got to look beneath that. But so when I started writing this novel and I wanted to look at those stories and how they recorded any feminist elements, and sometimes I would be typing and I would be, oh my God, I can't believe that. Because some of them just happened, the interpretation would just come like a bulb coming on, like, Baba, and I'll be, oh my God, that's it. I guess that is a very feminist interpretation of those stories. I don't know what masculinists would do with them, but it was interesting as I grew older and what those stories then started to mean to me. And so I wanted not just to rewrite them and interpret them, but I wanted to bring them wholesale into a text and tell them. Sometimes you just chirabo, who is telling them from a child's point of view? And then you watch in Suta, who is grown up, just sitting there enjoying, realizing what the chirabo doesn't realize what is going on. But for me, it's very important for the reader to look at these stories and say, ha ha, because we all have those stories in our traditions. And it would make you go back into your traditional stories and say, what the F were they talking about?
I just listening to you, I was smiling because it is true, like quite similar in a way. And and it's funny because when people ask me your early influences, I always say one of them is my grandmother, for example. And when, for example, people talk about imagery in my prose, and I think partly I did work a lot on that, but I think it initiated with her because of those kind of stories that she used to tell us when we were in a refugee camp in Sudan. I remember, for example, vividly that story she told me once about this a woman who escaped during her wedding night, and she was wearing white, and it was pitch dark, and she was running through the forest, and all that image of white and night, and this idea of also a woman escaping something. It's something that really sat with me to this day. I can't forget. And and again, I remember like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he had similar interpretation also of that kind of fantastical stories and where they kind of originate. And I think it's and it the source of inspiration isn't always text. That's why I always tell my students, or for me anyway, it's never been a book. It's always been something besides a book, like oral stories that you were talking about, or cinema, or things like that. So it's fascinating when you open up your history, what you really discover.
Indeed. What would we be without our
Yeah,
grandmothers?
absolutely.
Well, Sulaiman, you opened up. Oh, sorry, Jennifer, you're about to say. You opened up an interesting point where in your novel we see film and almost theater operating in a very interesting way, where the sort of opening character Jamal, who's a recurring character, has this cinema set up in his compound in the refugee camp, which if you haven't, for those who haven't read, there's essentially a large white sheet ironed and like put on sort of these two cross beams standing up, and there's a hole cut out. So you see both Saba's house specifically, but also the people in the refugee camp enact out their dramas, enact out their fantasies. And I was curious how you came to that device. It's very cool.
I have no sense of memory of how I came with the device, because like I think I was operating a different level, and I know I sound quite strange when I say that to people, but really, like in a way, I'm gonna steal the line that Jennifer just used before, which is I prepare myself and I prepare my characters, and I prepare things, and then I don't really feel anything. But I think for me, the whole book, when the characters, all of them migrate to the refugee camp, they find themselves in a place of scarcity. And so it all becomes about this kind of human, not only it goes beyond the survival mechanism, it's all about actually inventing the alternatives, And so one of them, for example, is Jamal, who used to work in an Italian-built cinema in Asmara before he fled. And so he comes to the camp, and then, and it's all for him, it's all about the cinema, it's all about love, it's all about sexual desires that he has. And then he comes up with this idea where he, stick a hole, and he kind of, watches the camp exist in that kind of, as if it were a film made in a faraway land, But I think for me, ultimately, it's because when I lived in a camp, we didn't have books. But every time we visited the city, we would go to visit a cinema. And so I would watch Bollywood and Bruce Lee and those kind of films. And I think ultimately, I'm so fascinated by cinema. I'm so fascinated by this idea of the kind of beauty it embraces, but it kind of how the camera really allows you to zoom in and out, and kind of how it breaks the kind of, as it does zoom in and out, it breaks the kind of the barriers or the borders between the realism and the illusion. And that's for me what living in a refugee camp is.
You know what? When I was reading your book, I felt that Jamal, that hall that was in the shed, he had access to most of the huts. And I felt that Jamal was a keeper of all the secrets that were going on in that place, because he watched everything. He watched everyone. Of course, he was always fantasizing about Saba and watching her, but he was watching everybody. And for me, that was a little bit similar to Nsota, who is actually blind.
Right.
But people say she's a witch because she knows everything that goes on in the village. And they can't work out why or how. So, for example, when Chirabo has had a sexual encounter, when she goes to visit her, she said, you should have told him if you're going to open your legs to a man, but she is totally blind. And it's always those characters that fascinate us, because they are not necessarily out of the air. We didn't pluck them out of the air. They come from somewhere, from within our community. Okay, we blow them out of proportion and we develop aspects of them, but they are out of our worlds, and how those characters then stand out in their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And also, like, what I love about those kind of characters is that kind of ability not to self-censor, to self-censor. And for me, they're the most liberating characters to work with in a way, because, they, with Jamal, for example, he just came to me like, with Hagos, for example, I didn't have to do any work. It was just like encountering a river somewhere in a forest. It was so beautiful and calm and soothing. But with Jamal, I found that kind of his level of not censoring himself, like you were saying, looking at people through the screen, or like, you know, the blind person you talking in your book, is that this idea, like, we're talking about human being the way they are, you know, with the, and that's one of the early fights I have to have with this book, which is I wasn't going to censor anything. I wasn't going to censor the open toilet, for example, and
Yeah.
its a proximity to the characters.
Yeah.
You know, I was, it's like, no, because Jamal was the character that actually introduced me to that power of like saying, you know, I'm gonna see Saba when she's masturbating, when she's
Oh
going in
yeah.
the toilet, when
Yeah.
she's cooking, when she's teaching. So there's definitely, I kind of recognize that power you're talking about.
Indeed, but it's also, I think, for me especially, it's because I grew up on Western novels,
Right,
and they were always frustrating. You know,
right.
they would talk about sex and then they would not talk about sex really. And I'm like, and then when I grew up, I was like, no, that's not what it is like, really. You know,
Uh,
oh, there was always a very controlled storytelling. And I found that restrictive, because when I sit by myself on my own, there's so much going on. And
right.
the novel is the safest place for me to say everything. You know, everything
That's
that I wouldn't say out loud. Why would I censor myself here? It's the only place where I can disembody my words, send them out in the world without myself, just with my name on top of the book, and say everything I want to say.
I love that, you know, the book, the novel is the safest. I really love that. I really love that because I see it, and it's exactly my soul. It's like, you know, you know, people ask me like, you know, why are you so bold? Actually, I don't even have a sense that I'm really bold. And exactly because I think of what you're saying is that I feel safe in that format, in that world, in that thing that I have no shame, no anything, no prejudice, no judgment, no feeling even. It's just about putting it out there and then sending it. And I discovered that from the first book I did with The Consequences of Love, where people were like, oh, what is, you know? And so I really like that phrase you use, the safest place. And I totally agree, because for us also, for me, it's all been about how not to restrain myself. I'm absolutely beyond novels that are all about restraining, all about subtlety. Of course, there are novels like that, and we really appreciate that. But I think for us, the whole idea of novels should be really left to the novelist to decide on the format. Like, you know, it's not about, you know, it's almost like, it seems to me, a lot of writers go through MFA program, whatever it is, and then you come out so clean, so clear, with all the rules of, you know, of literature, and they are important. But I think really when you lose yourself in a novelistic way, you really have no idea of what rules you're paying attention to. It's all about letting go.
No, absolutely. And for women, remember, with the novel, there's no immediate reaction. So for me as a woman, when things that I say, you know, out loud, people would react immediately with, "Ah, she didn't say that." With the novel, there's no such thing. But also the reader himself or herself is going to pull themselves out of society and be alone with the novel. So this is where we should say all the unsayable.
Absolutely. The imagination in my, it's like I was telling you before we started, I have disappeared. It almost took me 10 years to do this book. I have disappeared because my imagination was my world. My imagination was my best friend, my lover, my everything. And so I totally identify with what he's saying.
So along those lines of just sort of what you're saying about saying the unsayable and having the space in the novel to say like necessary things you couldn't allow, you both do something in your books where I've never seen the female body described as like in-depthly in that way. Like it's candid, it's pornographic sometimes, it's whole other times it's traumatized, it's abused. And I was so intrigued by your approach to just giving the body that like carnality, and like specifically the female body, because we don't like we discuss it in novels in a lot of terms of what it can do, its production, but not its the physicality and the person associated with it.
For me, that has always been the trouble, the hiding of the female body. That's where the trouble begins, at least for us women, the mystery, the closing it up, I felt that the whole, a lot of myth have been created around the women's body because of invisibility. What you see is my face, you see my hands, and you see a bit of my legs. For a long time, my grandmother could not show her legs. In fact, I never saw her legs. That level of invisibility has led to all the trouble that we find ourselves in as women. So let's put it out and demystify it. There's nothing foul about the vagina, and you can say it. It's a vagina, but it's all of that. And I know in my culture, a lot of myths were created. So if a woman climbs a tree, it dries. If a woman sits with her legs wide open near fire, it goes out. Or if a woman climbs a tree, the fruit goes sour. Those are all myths that have been created around the woman's body, but they all started with ignorance because the body is hidden. So for me, if I'm going to liberate myself, I'm going to put the body out there for everybody to see.
I think that's really powerful. I think for me, it's that sense of kind of liberation that happens to the writer through the characters in my book anyway. And I totally, working with Saba, for example, in the way, like especially when she moved to the camp and she started to see her body, to kind of, and to pleasure herself really, to embrace those desires. They were also, I think, what I always say this, I wrote the book, but I think the book also rewrote me, because I think in a way, because I came out of this book more rounded person or more in tune with my own desires. And I think those are kind of things I've learned through Saba, the kind of thing to look at my body and see the kind of hidden, the hidden femininity that I have, the hidden masculinity, the hidden power that I have, the wounds that I have, and so on. And I think, once I started to embrace all the kind of probabilities and possibilities within my body, then I've realized actually how powerful writing a novel is, and the power actually that a novel or a novelist, for me as a novelist, I don't really intend to change the world. And I think the novel changes me first. And I think, and that's the kind of power relationship with the female body or the male body in the book, and what they did to me personally as a writer.
On that note, that discussion went surprisingly fast, and we are now in the section for the audience Q&A. So if you have any questions and you're watching on Zoom, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're watching via Facebook Live, you can ask your question in the comment thread. So now that I have a second while you guys are putting together your questions, I do have another one. I was sort of curious, and this question is for both of you. We can start off with Sulaiman, but if you would describe your book as a feminist novel, and if so, why or why not?
I don't think I can describe my novel as anything, because I think that's the power of letting go. I think it's the most difficult to hit the button send to send a book to your publisher or editor or agent, whoever you're working with. And I think after that, it's just letting it be described. So many, I mean, some readers think it's a feminist book, other readers would think it's a sexy book, other readers would think, oh no, it's a frustrating book. because it doesn't have a structure. Some other people would think, oh, no, it's like, it's a very cinematic. But, you know, and so that's the kind of, the power of the novel is that really it becomes someone else's property once you let it go.
And that's, I think that's where I'm going to differ from you, Sulaiman, because I would describe my novel as feminist. Like, there's
Sure.
no way, there's just no way I would not describe it as feminist, because the word feminism is littered all over the place. And it's also Mwenkanonkano, which is a traditional form or indigenous form of feminism. And this is why one of the major characters is a traditional feminist, because she has been listening. It's 1975, remember, and she's been listening to the World Conference of Women that was in Mexico City, and she's excited about it, but it doesn't ring right for her as a Ganda woman. And she looks around the village and she imagines that kind of feminism that is coming from the West is not working very well. So when she's preparing this girl, she's preparing her for the traditional Ganda feminism. So I might turn around and say, oh no, it's not a feminist novel, whatever. But really, it defined itself, because I have quite a few feminist men and women in there. Now, none of them uses the word feminism to describe themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the word feminism came from the West and it's a Western text. But for me, feminists do not necessarily call themselves feminists. It's the actions. Okay. So for me, Sulaiman, you are a feminist. Totally.
I'm a foot. The thing is, I'm a foot soldier for feminism. That's for sure. There's no doubt about that. You know, and exactly. I think you're absolutely right. I just feel like it's easy for men to call themselves or to call ourselves feminists and not do the work. You know.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? I think for me, it's just to call yourself a feminist is such a goal. It's such a thing that you need to do so much work for a man, you know, steep into patriarchy. And I really totally believe all of us men, you know, we have patriarchy in us some way or not, you know, whether we like it or not. And it's about doing the work to kind of, you know, to get rid yourself from that kind of curse. And I think, you know, and that's why I would say, like, you know, my goal is to be a feminist. So it's a work in progress.
That's a wonderful way of putting it.
Yeah, because it's just, I can come out and say I'm a feminist, and I, you know, and still, like, there are so many things. I look at myself, my relationship, the way I conduct my life, and I think there's so much I need to do before I get to that word.
Yeah, it's like dismantling the. Oh, sorry, you were about to say, Jennifer?
No. I was agreeing with him. Just respect.
Yeah, no, it's dismantling the like sort of notion of being an ally as like performative as opposed to like actually doing the work. Is what I think I'm hearing you say.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then we have our first audience question from SC Hecht, who asks, are your books received the same or differently in your countries of origin and the US? And we can start off with Jennifer for this one.
Okay, my novel has just come out in Uganda. It came out in October, at the beginning of October, and I haven't been back there to hear or see what's going on. But the bookseller is telling me it's doing very well. Because I tend to write with the Ugandan reader in mind, you know, so I'm talking to the Ugandan and I'm talking about our world, and everybody else is outside looking in. But the beauty of that for me, it's and I tend to compare the novel to the Mona Lisa, you know, because that picture was drawn a long time ago before the camera came along. Because when you look in the camera, when the picture comes out, everybody who stands in front of you, you're looking at them. But this guy just drew the picture and he was looking at him, but he stepped away, and each one of us who steps in front of the picture, it's looking at us. But that's what I do with my novel. It's focused on the Ugandan reader, but when a non-Ugandan picks it up, it's talking to them, because you know what? Ugandans are just like everybody else.
When you, Sulaiman?
I think for me, it's like, I don't think it's published or it's out in Ethiopia, of course, not Eritrea, obviously.
Yeah.
But what I have is that I'm so lucky. I have readers who actually take it to those places, you know, and so there's that power and that energy of readers that I love. You know, they you know, you see it through Twitters. They're sharing the novel in Ethiopia, or in Eritrea as well, and so that gives me satisfaction. And I think for the moment, given the kind of political situation, especially in Eritrea, I'm really happy with that. You know, I know that, for example, my first novel, I'm not getting paid for it in Saudi Arabia, for example. There's so many people reading it underground because it's banned, obviously, and so, like, you know, and you know, and that gives me satisfaction. Yeah, exactly, because I keep hearing people like, oh yeah, you know, and they, you know, they go their PDF, they kind of sharing it. There's nothing you can do. There's and you know, for me, it's like, I hope they, you know, they learning something, you know, or I don't know, enjoying it, whatever it means to them. And so that's the most important thing.
And our next and unfortunately final question is going to be from Rabia on Facebook, who asks, Sulaiman, can you tell us your favorite scene in Jennifer's novel? And Jennifer, can you tell us your favorite scene in Sulaiman's novel?
Oh.
This may be a tricky one to end on. Sorry.
I'm picking it out.
No.
Oh.
I don't have the copy with me. Oh my God, it's a PDF.
You do. Oh.
Oh my God. I'm gonna say, I'm just gonna say, like, I think it's really difficult for me to always, even with my own book, to pick a scene. You know, I don't want to dismiss. You know, maybe Jennifer will differ with me here, but it's just, for me, it's like the book. It's that you see the absence. What I look for in a book, and I find it with Jennifer, is that the absence of the writer. You know, I'm in the story, and the story takes its power, and I'm there, and I'm losing myself. And that's, for me, I think, scene after scene. It's not one single scene that does it. It's scene after scene. And you know, and I wish I had the PDF with me here, but I think, yeah, it's just like when like she said before, when she prepared her characters and I don't meet her anymore in the book, I think that's, for me, where I feel like grateful to the writer.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Now, for me, there was this moment. You know, in the beginning, we see Saba taking away her brother's chance to go to school. And one time she picks up her books and he runs and cries, you know, and she goes to school and studies. And then they go to the camp and he finds a man who loves her. Now, Saba is so blind, but he finds a man who loves him and she's just not aware, you know. And then he comes and, you know, he's made to marry her and she does not see her brother's pain, you know, and he cries and he throws things, but she does not see it. So for me, it was the moment when she's dressed as a bride and she's marching off to her husband's house. And for me, at that moment, I knew he had just married her brother. She might be dressed in all that because, you know, his heart was blue He had got all the frills and the beautiful beds and whatever into his hut. And she was walking into the husband's hut, which was not as beautiful. But there she was thinking she was the bride when it was her brother all along. I can't get that scene out of my mind.
Thank you, Jennifer. You're so kind. Thank you so much.
No,
I remember writing that scene. Thank you. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
no. Please finish, Sulaiman. My
absolutely.
apologies.
I'm just grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I'm sorry to have to end this conversation, but it could go on for hours. I'd love to do it again. With that said, if you haven't picked up your copy of A Girl is a Body of Water, you can do so here. If you'll notice, there are lots of paper tabs because I loved it. And same for Sulaiman's book. Can you see it? Yes. Silence is My Mother Tongue. And there are links to purchase both dropped in the chat if you're on Zoom. And on that note, thank you both so much. It was fascinating and wonderful to be able to talk to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you, Jennifer.
Wonderful.
Yes, it was an honor. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. You guys, I
Take care.
had a terrible time reading, and this just, I couldn't put either book down. I appreciate it so much.
I appreciate it too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Good night, Sulaiman.
Good night. Take care, Jennifer. Speak soon, yeah? Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.